Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21, where we read of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, up to this point, we've seen Jesus revealing himself to those who meet him and believe in him. Not everybody had, but the camera has been focused in chapters 1 through 4 mostly on the positive responses. There was John the Baptist, there were his disciples, there was Nicodemus, there was a Samaritan woman, John the Baptist, again, had been mentioned. And finally, there was a royal official who had come to Jesus to have his son healed long distance. And those stories had been in chapters 1 through 4. Now, as we come to chapter 5, and we're going to be in chapter 6 now, in chapters 5 through 11, we've seen those who hear him and reject him. Remember how we had the healing of the paralyzed man, but that man didn't really seem to believe in him. So there were the Jews in Jerusalem. Um, we'd had mention of them briefly, but we're actually seeing them in chapter 5. We're going to see the followers in Galilee, even though there are some who wanted, or they're going to want to come and make him king. Yet overall, they're not really accepting his teachings. And when Jesus opens his mouth and begins to teach, a lot of them are going to leave. We'll see the Pharisees at the temple. We'll see the priests and the high priest all seeking to turn against Jesus. And that's going to be the movement starting in chapter 5, intensifying all the way to chapter 11. When in chapter 11, they're actually going to be talking not just to kill Jesus, but actually to kill Lazarus. Jesus had raised from someone from the dead. Let's overturn that. Let's kill him so he can't testify to that. Now, we pick up in chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And then we have a little note, or Tiberias. It's the same sea. Notice you've got in the region of Galilee a big body of water. As you go down to Judea in the south, you've got a bigger body of water. That's the Dead Sea. But the Sea of Galilee. And John calls it a sea. So does Matthew. So does Mark. Luke never does. Luke actually calls it a lake. And that's how we would probably see it as well. So there's the Sea of Galilee. And if we look at it, you can see across it. It's I've seen much bigger lakes actually. Um, the entire lake, the entire Sea of Galilee, is about 500 plus feet below sea level. Dead Sea is even lower, but it's like a big body of water with high ground almost completely encircling it, except maybe a bit where the water flows into the north and where it flows out in the south. So here he is, a close-up of the Sea of Galilee, and we've got some villages, but the villages weren't mentioned leading up to this. In fact, the scene changed at the end of chapter 5. We were in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden we're back in Galilee, and specifically we're going to go, notice, to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Jewish people, for the most part, were on the west side and a bit in the northwest. So this isn't completely, in Gentile territory. But as you went to as you went to the east side, you're going to find more Gentiles, especially the southeast. But they're not in that portion. So they're going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and the way they're doing it apparently is by water. So, verse 2, a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. We've seen a sampling of that previously, but not a lot of detail given on specific healings so far. Verse 3, then Jesus went up on the mountain. Now, we're not told what mountain, but we're looking here at a picture of the very north side of the Sea of Galilee. In fact, if you look down in the foreground, you can see the Jordan River winding and turning as it makes its way into the Sea of Galilee. It flows in from here, flows out again at the other end, at the south end. But you do see some mountains in the distance. And so he comes to some of the high ground there, and he sits down with his disciples. Verse 4, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. And that's telling me that at least a year has passed since John chapter 2, since that was a Passover as well. Now we're coming up to another Passover. The question everyone has, there was an unnamed feast in chapter 5, but was that a Passover or was that some other feast? We're not told, so I'm not going to speculate. But it's been at least a year since John chapter 2. And so you had the Passover in John chapter 2, you had the unnamed feast in chapter 5, and now we're back to another Passover. We'll see one more Passover when we get to John chapter 12. That's going to be as we get close to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So at least 3 Passovers are going to be mentioned in the Gospel of John, spanning the ministry of Jesus. Verse 5, therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip is one of the apostles, remember we were introduced to him back in chapter 1, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? they're not near any grocery stores. There's no grocers nearby. And, where are we going to get some food, some bread? And notice this he was saying to test him, to test Philip, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Jesus already has it planned out, but he hasn't let his disciples know. And so he wants to present them with a problem before he presents the answer. Sometimes the Lord does that, where he'll give us the problem so we can see the problem before we get the answer. Now, sometimes he just gives us the answer and we don't even realize there was a problem there. But I think there is more room for growth if we see the problem first. So this was being said to test him. Verse 7, Philip answered him. And notice it turns into a math test instead of a faith test. 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. He pulls out his pocket calculator. He figures it out. A denarii was the average working wage for a lower class labor, like poor, sort of a poor man's job. We would say minimum wage. So not that they had such a thing. 200 denarii would be a lot of money, and he just looks at the crowd and he figures out how much that would cost, and it's far beyond their means if they even had a place to go purchase it. So 200 denarii worth of bread. Verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, and we've already been introduced to Andrew, and last time we saw him, we saw that Andrew was Simon Peter's brother. We're reminded of that again here, just in case you forgot Andrew. And Andrew says, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now, barley loaves, that's like second-rate bread, instead of whole wheat bread. This is like husk bread, it's like sort of lower class bread. And the term for fish here, not ichthus like we're used to seeing, but opsaria. This is a description of cooked fish. John is the only one who uses this term. And probably not, like full-size fish, probably something quite a bit smaller that had been pre-prepared, we would say fish and chips, something sort of small. And so he's, this one boy has a sort of a bag lunch, but what are these for so many people? How can that feed everybody? It can't. And the answer is that it can't, humanly speaking. Verse 10, Jesus said, have the people sit down. And it's interesting that he has this little note here. There was much grass in the place. I think it's Mark's account that talks about how the grass was green, which, okay. So there's a place for them to sit. Mark's account also, and by the way, the miracle that we're going to see here is given to us in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 Gospels. Other than the death, burial, and resurrection, this is the only miracle that's in all. I think it's about the only miracle. Maybe there might be 1 or 2 others that's given in all 4 Gospels. That's very unusual. They usually focus on different miracles. And so notice the men sat, and that's gender specific. There may have been women, there may have been children, there was at least 1 lad, but the men sat down in number about 5,000. There may have been quite a few more, but 5,000 of the men. Verse 11, Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, sometimes we talk about blessing the food, but instead, the scriptural manner is usually, if not always, to bless God, to give thanks to the Lord. And Jesus does that. And he distributed to those who were seated, likewise also of the fish, as much as they wanted. Now, how far do 2 little fish go? Well, they're going to go quite a ways. So he distributes it. Now, I think he does this through his disciples. He's not personally necessarily passing it out. He's using them to distribute the food. And notice the loaves and the fish. Again, that same term that we saw. Verse 12, when they were filled, really? 5 loaves and 2 fish filled them all? Was this a supernatural filling, or was this a supernatural multiplication? And the answer is given. Notice he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. They're going to gather a lot more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. So, yes, everyone is filled, but we find out there was a supernatural multiplication that was involved. Remember, a skeptic looked at this, a friend of mine many years ago, and said, where did all the dump trucks of food come from? And I said, that's the point. It came, there were thousands of people all around to watch it, and nobody brought the food. It was supernaturally multiplied, and they ate it. It's not like something that was just an illusion. They picked it up, they touched it, they ate it. And then there was a lot more leftovers when they went to gather it. Notice they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. 12 apostles, 12 baskets. I think maybe there's something symbolic too. But those baskets are going to be with them, and they didn't gather them to just throw them away. They weren't just doing house cleaning. Notice, so that nothing will be lost. I'm assuming they're going to take these with them, even a bit later when they find themselves without Jesus on a boat. But they'll have 12 baskets, maybe to serve as a reminder. Hey, we can trust. We can trust in the Lord, even when He's not physically with us. All right, verse 14. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, when they speak about the prophet, that's an Old Testament prophecy, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, where Moses had said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. Jesus is that prophet. Now, he's much more than just a prophet, but he is that prophet. And so as far as they've gone in their understanding, they're correct. They haven't gone far enough, but as far as they've gone, they are correct in that. However, they're going to come to a different conclusion about what to do about that. So verse 15, so Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king. Let me just say, Jesus was already king. They hadn't previously recognized that. They had not recognized the nature of his kingship, and they want to take him, notice, by force, not willingly, but by force, and make him to be the kind of king they want him to be. What kind of king do they want him to be? They want to make him a king that's going to give them free food. In fact, this is going to come back later on in the chapter again, this desire for more food. So they have their political agenda. It is not the political agenda of Jesus. I think that sort of scenario goes on from age to age. I live in a country that's very that has some very divisive politics between Republicans and Democrats and independents. And let me just say, I don't know that Jesus fits into any one of those categories. I think all those categories can fall short of seeing him as king. And so as a result, notice, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. And so they want to make him king. He is going to be seen as king. He's going to describe himself later on as king, but only on his terms, not on their terms. So, verse 16, now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, I'm assuming they had brought the boat with them, they're not sailing one, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. And it had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. And so they leave without Jesus. Now, this is the first time John has described disciples in a boat. If we had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we might have found out that they had been in a boat earlier. There had been different times where they were in a boat with Jesus and storms and things like that. But John doesn't go into that, so I'm not going to either. So they're on the sea without Jesus, I'm assuming with 12 baskets of leftovers. And the sea began to be stirred up because a strong wind, a mega wind in the Greek text, was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. Now, the fact that they are rowing when they're on a sea with a strong wind tells me that the wind isn't going in the way they want to go. So the wind is going one way, the rowing is going in a different direction, and 3 or 4 miles of rowing is quite a bit of rowing. Notice they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened because people don't walk on sea. People don't walk on water. That this is not something that they had ever been led to expect. This was not within their purview. They're not near land. They're going to be, but they're not yet. And they were frightened. And so they've got the strong wind, but walking on the sea isn't something they had expected. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Other gospel accounts actually have them seeing and thinking it's some sort of phantom or ghost or something like. John doesn't go into that. It is I. Do not be afraid. So they were willing to receive him into the boat, as if there was maybe some question about that prior to his self-identification of himself. And now that he was in the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Jesus comes into the boat, and the struggling, the rowing, the long night is over. And they are with Jesus, and they are at rest. Now, let me just say, that's a picture of our relationship too. If you are willing to receive him, remember how John described this back in John chapter 1? As many as received him, to them he gave the right to be called sons of God. If you have been willing to receive him, can I say, into your life, into your boat, you'll find the going a lot easier. You'll find the destination, maybe it's a new destination to which you've been called. And so you trust in him and receive him into your boat, into your life, into your heart.